Justice should not depend on fame. I'm Michael Smerconish in the Philly Burbs. Think about the disconnect in recent headlines concerning drug deaths. We live in a country where who dies from illegal drugs often determines whether justice is even pursued. Because when a celebrity dies, we prosecute the suppliers. Think Matthew Perry. His illegal ketamine suppliers indicted, convicted. One doctor has received a sentence of 2.5 years in prison, while the others are still awaiting their sentencing. Or Michael K. Williams, the dealer who sold him fentanyl-laced heroin, sentenced to 10 years behind bars. Or Tyler Skaggs, the Angels pitcher whose supplier was convicted of distribution resulting in death, sentenced to 22 years. These are terrible tragedies, but they're also proof that when the victim is famous, the system, it snaps into action. But for the other 100,000 Americans who die each year, usually no headlines, no chain of custody trace, no high-profile prosecutions, and ultimately no justice in many instances. This is not to say that no supplier to average citizens is ever prosecuted, but even of those who are, how many customers do they get to before anything happens? Meanwhile, a celebrity dies and the authorities, they step up immediately. A system that delivers accountability for the famous while ignoring the non-famous is not a just system, it's a morally inverted one. And that disparity, that silent, corrosive inequality, is why many Americans, myself included, have supported aggressive interdiction of drug-running vessels. Because for many families, it's the only point along the chain of death where anybody connected to their loved one's fatal dose ever faces any consequence. Now, I want to be clear. I'm not endorsing the second boat strike on September 2nd. Claims that the second strike were lawful, it seems dubious to me. As the Department of Defense War Manual itself expressly states, orders to fire upon the shipwreck would be clearly illegal. So if the reports of what the video shows are accurate, there's a problem. As the New York Times reported yesterday, quote, 2 survivors, shirtless, clung to the hull unsuccessfully to flip it back over, then climbed on it and slipped off into the water over and over. The Times also reporting that the tape shows the survivors were perhaps waving a sign of surrender before the attack. So far, the videotape has been a political Rorschach test, with Republican congressional leaders saying, move along, there's nothing to see here, and Democrats say they find it deeply disturbing, which is why we ought to see it, the American people. Full transparency is essential whenever lethal force is used in our name. Still, the broader moral and legal debate cannot be separated from the sheer scale of the carnage that these traffickers are unleashing. CDC data shows that more than 105,000 Americans died of drug overdoses in 2023. That's the official number from the National Vital Statistics System. That's the highest ever recorded. The numbers seem to have dipped since then, but they're still sky high. Although the CDC tallies all overdoses together, nearly 3/4 involve illicitly manufactured synthetic opioids like fentanyl. So when I say about 100,000 Americans die each year from illegal drugs, that's not rhetorical flair. That's the CDC's reality. And where do those illegal drugs come from? The supply chain today is frighteningly efficient. Fentanyl precursor chemicals are overwhelmingly produced in China. Those chemicals are shipped to Mexico, where the cartels synthesize fentanyl at industrial scale. The finished product then smuggled across the U.S.-Mexico border in quantities small enough to fit in a backpack, but potent enough to kill millions. And the maritime routes, like the vessel involved in that September 2nd attack, they move cocaine, heroin, and synthetic precursors northward through Central America and the Caribbean before entering the U.S. distribution pipelines. And that's the supply chain behind tens of thousands of American deaths every year. Some critics argue that any use of force against drug traffickers violates international law because traffickers are not state actors and have not initiated an armed attack. I think that's an outdated lens. Under Article 51 of the UN Charter, nations retain an inherent right of self-defense. And modern U.S. practice has never limited that right to state-sponsored attacks. After September 11, the U.S. used force against al-Qaeda, a non-state actor. In Grenada, 1983, the U.S. used force to protect American citizens not to repel an attack. Panama, 1989, the U.S. seized Manuel Noriega, in part because he was flooding the U.S. with cocaine, contributing to widespread death and addiction. These precedents recognize that grave, ongoing threats from non-state actors can justify force in certain circumstances. And when the illicit drug supply chain kills more Americans annually than most wars, then I say it's not unreasonable for the United States to view certain interdictions as a form of self-defense. But of course, that principle has to be applied carefully and with facts and evidence, legality, accountability, which is why the second strike on September the 2nd needs to be fully investigated and fully revealed. Recent polling shows just how torn Americans are on issues. A Reuters Ipsos poll from mid-November said only 29% of Americans support killing suspected drug traffickers abroad without judicial process. Yet a Harvard-Harris poll from early October said 71% support for destroying boats bringing drugs from South America. And a CBS News YouGov poll from mid-November shows the public almost evenly split when it comes to, quote, using military force to attack boats suspected of bringing drugs into the U.S. 53% said yes, 47% were opposed. Same issue, very different reactions based on the framing, and that's precisely why transparency matters. People can't form a legitimate judgment about what the U.S. military did on September 2nd until they see what really happened. We need to hold drug traffickers accountable for the mass killing that they're driving inside the United States, and that includes robust interdiction of drug-running vessels. We need to value every American life equally, not just the ones whose names appear in the headlines.